Christmas Lights, Part 1 by Leslea Wahl. Camilla stared out the side window of her family's SUV, watching the snow-covered fields blur past. Every so often, she'd spy a farmhouse in the distance, adorned with festive Christmas lights, although those beacons of holiday cheer amid the long shadows of the fading winter afternoon did little to boost her mood. She, her younger brother Max, and their parents were on their way to spend Christmas with Grandpa, something they didn't normally do, but this Christmas was different. Grandma passed away over the summer, and they weren't about to let Grandpa spend the holiday alone. With each passing mile and field, they not only drew nearer to Grandpa, but also closer to the end of the year. Thank goodness. Camilla pressed her head against the cold window. 2020 had started out with such promise. She'd begun the year by hanging out with a new group of friends. She'd also been preparing for the upcoming spring soccer tryouts. And had a shot of making the school's competitive team. And she was pretty sure Jackson Meyer was on the verge of asking her out. Camilla watched the flakes of snow swirling through the air, remembering how great everything had been during those early months of the year. But then it all changed. Her world came crashing down with one word, a word she'd never heard before, COVID, which brought on a slew of other words that had never been part of her vocabulary. Lockdowns, social distancing, masks, online schooling, and just like that, there would be no spring soccer season, no hanging out with friends, and no possible dates with Jackson. Instead, she was stuck at home with her brother and parents. Then came the devastating news that her beloved grandmother had died. Camilla still couldn't believe the family hadn't even been allowed to have a decent funeral. Then the school year came, which was usually an exciting time, but it brought modified schedules, periodic online classes, and few social interactions, completely ruining her new friendships. The best year of her life had transformed into some depressing dystopian world. Needless to say, after so much disappointment, finding something to feel festive about proved difficult. Wow, this storm is really getting bad. Dad's tense voice drew Camilla from her thoughts. Snow violently pelted the windshield. Dad's grip on the steering wheel turned his knuckles the same color as the unexpected blizzard. We can't see anything. This is too dangerous to be driving in. Mom turned her worried expression toward Dad. He nodded in agreement. There's a town coming up. We should stop and let the storm pass. The tense minutes ticked by as we slowly continued through the raging snowstorm. No one uttered a word as the swirling snow made the rest of the world disappear. Max, who's usually full of jokes, turned to look at Camilla with wide, terrified eyes. When the green exit sign came into view, the family let out a collective sigh of relief. Dad steered the vehicle off the highway, the whiteout decreasing the visibility by the moment. As the SUV reached the top of the incline of the off-ramp, it suddenly began to fishtail. Dad struggled to control the vehicle. They spun sideways, but eventually came to a stop. Then, in one terrifying moment, the SUV resumed sliding backwards. Camilla slammed against her seat as the SUV bumped down an embankment. She squeezed her eyes shut and prayed a Hail Mary. With an abrupt jolt, the vehicle stopped moving. Camilla looked out the window as understanding flooded through her. They'd slid off the road and were now stuck in a ditch.
Part 2 by Andrea Jo Rodgers. At least Camilla thought it was a ditch, but now, as their SUV began teetering back and forth, she realized with horror that they were dangling off the edge of a cliff. "Hold on, everyone," she shouted. The SUV lurched, and suddenly they were free-falling. Mom's piercing screams filled the evening air. Camilla uttered a simple, silent prayer. Save us, God. After what was only seconds, but seemed like an eternity, the SUV slammed into the ground. Tree branches exploded through the rear window. Camilla was thrown violently forward and then backwards within the confines of her seatbelt. The SUV suddenly became ominously quiet. A cloud of powdery white snow blew up into the air, surrounding them. Mom? Dad? Max? Silence. Panic bubbled up inside Camilla, threatening to suffocate her. She called their names again, but there was no response. Miraculously, Camilla was unharmed. She unstrapped her seatbelt and turned towards Max. His eyes fluttered open. My ankle, I think it's broken, he whimpered. It's going to be okay, buddy, she said. She turned her attention to her parents in the front seats. She saw the rise and fall of their chests and could hear that they were breathing. They were unconscious, but thank God they were alive. Camilla pulled her cell phone out of her pocket. No signal. She feared no one would ever find them here. They would surely freeze to death. She stared out the frosty window and blinked. Then she blinked again. There before her, swirling in the snow, was an image of Grandma. She looked beautiful and radiant, just the way Camilla remembered her. Grandma? She asked tentatively. She reached out and touched the glass. Suddenly, a voice inside her head seemed to say, "Follow the Christmas lights." She blinked again. The image of Grandma was gone. Max's voice broke into Camilla's thoughts. Are Mom and Dad dead? No, but they are unconscious. I'm going to go for help. It's going to be your job to take care of them, Camilla said. Mom always kept an old laundry basket filled with emergency supplies in the rear of the SUV. Although the back of their vehicle was crushed, Camilla was able to reach back and retrieve much of the contents of the basket. She placed blankets over her parents and Max. I'm going to take the flashlight with me because it's going to grow dark soon. Suddenly, missing the soccer season and struggling through online classes seemed trivial. Now, Camilla found herself thrust into a desperate struggle between life and death. Her only chance to save her family and herself was to forge into the unknown and pray she could somehow find help. She thought of Grandpa. He'd already lost Grandma this year. She couldn't let him lose the rest of his family. Maybe, once he realized they were late, he'd call the police department to come find them. But even if he did, how would they ever spot them down here at the bottom of a ravine? An image of Jackson Meyer's face passed through Camilla's mind. She thought of her friends, both old and new. Spring soccer team tryouts were only 3 months away. She had a lot to live for.
Part 3, written by Stephanie Engelman. The car had fallen at an angle, with Camilla's side at its highest point. She had to throw her weight up and into the door to finally heave it open and climb from the vehicle, but at last was free. Grateful she'd worn boots and a warm coat, she scrabbled up the side of the ravine and to the street, hoping against hope that a car might pass by and offer help. No such luck. Straining her eyes to peer through the white curtain of snow, Camilla couldn't make out a single headlight. Apparently, every other driver on the road had decided to seek shelter and wait out the storm, just as Mom and Dad had planned to do. Follow the Christmas lights, Grandma had said. The vision had been so surreal, Camilla wondered now if she had been hallucinating. Regardless, it seemed like good advice. The trouble was, the thickening snow hid any tiny twinkles of light she might have been able to see. Once again, Camilla looked up and down the road, this time trying to gain her bearings. Recognizing the exit ramp Dad had been attempting to use, she followed its length, trudging through snow already well above her ankles, until it finally teed into a narrow road. Mom had said there was a town coming up, but there was no sign to indicate which direction she should turn. Camilla stood for a long moment, staring right and then left, then right again, hoping for some indication of which way she should go. Glancing back toward the ravine that held her family, she let out a desperate groan. There was no time to waste, she knew, but turning left or right would make all the difference in the world. Okay, God, she finally said out loud as the snow began to gather on her shoulders. I know it's been a while since we talked, but I could really use some help right now. There had been a time not so long ago when Camilla would have expected a response, a time when talking to God had been a regular part of her life, when she'd felt his guiding hand guiding her decisions, friendships, and activities. But that had been a time when she'd looked forward to seeing friends at youth group, when going to Mass had been the Sunday routine, when soccer season was a given and school days would have been long and boring had it not been for the constant presence of friends. Now, when she saw her friends, their faces were obscured by masks, their voices muffled by fabric. Mass was a strange affair, free from singing, with assigned seating and firm instructions to disinfect your pew. School, though open for a few months, had shut down again, leaving her holed up in her bedroom to learn alone, with only the questionable merits of video conference calls to break up the monotony. As if taking away her friends, her school, and most of her activities hadn't been enough, 2020 had also taken away her beloved grandma. Right, God. I should have known better than to think you're going to listen. Not this year. Maybe next. Resolved, Camilla turned to her right and took a step into the snowy unknown.
Part 4 by Carolyn Astfalk. She swung the flashlight, the dim blur of illuminated snow preventing her from seeing more than a few yards ahead. A breeze kicked snow across the roadway, battering her side and stinging her cheek. Cold and wetness seeped into her shoes, making her toes tingle. The SUV would be insulated by snow and out of the wind, but how long would blankets keep her family warm? Tears stung her eyes, but she squeezed them closed and swallowed. She would not cry. Getting hysterical wouldn't help. Come on, God, please. A warbled call echoed behind her, making her glad she'd chosen right, not left. The only animals she'd spotted from the car had been cows, but coyotes probably roamed these parts. The flashlight dimmed, and her chest tightened as she beat it against her leg. No, no, no. It couldn't go dead. It flickered and brightened, and Camilla sighed, a puff of white breath mingling with the falling snow. She scanned the roadside, searching for Christmas lights. A low rumble sounded behind her, mechanical, not animal. Walking backward, within seconds blurred headlights came into view, high off the ground. She nearly squealed with excitement. Ordinarily, she'd be leery of accepting help from a stranger, but lives depended on her getting help, soon. Maybe God had heard her reluctant prayer after all. The vehicle's engine resounded as it approached, and Camilla waved her arms, the flashlight's weak beam cutting through the snowfall. A hulking green Humvee came into focus, maintaining its speed, its lights nearly blinding her. Hey, I need help, she shouted over the engine noise and snow crunching under heavy tires. The Humvee rolled by, as if the driver hadn't seen her. A sob choked her as the red taillights rolled ahead. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and she rambled every rote prayer she could recall. A half-dozen prayers in, something shimmered in the distance. Yellows, reds, greens, Christmas lights. She blinked, willing her eyes to focus through the falling snow. Yes, something tall wrapped in lights, a cylinder. A silo? Yes, a silo. A snow-covered wooden fence came into view, and she jogged alongside it, the lights sharpening with every step. A break in the fence signaled a driveway. Deep tracks coming from the opposite lane created ruts with only a thin layer of powder on top. Someone had driven through, probably only minutes ago. Hope surged, and she jogged faster despite the ache in her near-frozen feet. More twinkling lights hung from a farmhouse roof. A barn blanketed in snow stood next door. A horse whinnied, and oh, thank God, a voice, low and soothing, responded. Camilla skidded to a stop in the barn's open doorway, her shoes catching where the earth met concrete. She teetered, her arms flailing, and yelped. A guy, around her age, turned from where he stood by a stall. He stared as she steadied herself and then peered beyond her. Can I help you? Could he help her? Overwhelmed by relief, she almost laughed. Yes, my dad lost control of our car at the exit. She jerked a thumb toward the highway. We went over a cliff. My brother's hurt and my parents are unconscious. She gasped, exhausted from running in the bitter cold. He rounded the stall, worry creasing his forehead. I'll get help. He snatched a set of keys from a hook, tucked them in a pocket, and started in the direction of the farmhouse. I'll be right back, he called, then stopped, turning. I'm Garrison, by the way.
Part 5 by Tony Kolenc. He was cute. Not as cute as Jackson, of course, but what could he do to save Mom and Dad and Max? Wait, she said, can't you just call 911 or get an adult to help? Garrison shook his head. That ice storm on Monday took down the only cell tower around here, and my Uncle Ben got rid of our landline before COVID. He's still at work right now. Just hang tight. With that, he disappeared into the swirling veil of snow. She waited in the deep freeze for what seemed like an eternity. He figures this would be Christmas Eve 2020. Grandma used to say that God worked in mysterious ways. Well, this night, this whole year actually, was a mystery. What good had God brought from it? The year was going to end as cold and unforgiving as the pandemic itself. Just then a loud engine echoed from under the Christmas lights. Garrison. A black-framed snowmobile glided toward her, polluting the silence with its ugly roar and spraying wet snow up the sides of her legs as it slid to a stop. "Hop on!" Garrison shouted, holding out a blue helmet that matched his own. In his lap was a fire-red kit marked First Aid, except her family was going to need a lot more than a Band-Aid to survive this storm. There was no time to argue. She muscled the tight helmet over her head, her hair was already ruined anyway, and pulled herself up behind him, locking her arms around his chest. The snowmobile lurched forward as a blast of icy air stung her neck. They raced toward the crash. Garrison seemed to know the way from her earlier description. When they finally arrived at the site, they tossed their helmets to the roadside. The snow had already covered most of the evidence from where the SUV had slid into the ditch. "Wait here," Garrison said, taking the first aid kit and scooting down the ravine, mostly using his backside and his strong gloved hands. Soon he was at the SUV, opening the angled driver's side door and reaching in with his flashlight. It sounded like he was talking to Max, whose whiny voice had risen another octave, probably due to the pain. Garrison's face was grim when he scrambled back up a few minutes later. "Your parents are still unconscious, and your brother's ankle's in bad shape. We need to get them to a hospital. There's one off the next exit." But how could they get them there? Not on a snowmobile. They'd have to ride to the hospital and lead the ambulance back to the crash. By then, Mom and Dad could be dead. That's when a vehicle approached with blinding lights. There it was again, that same green Humvee that ignored her pleas for help. It was large enough to fit her whole family inside, no doubt. "Look!" she called to Garrison. He peered toward the Humvee and shook his head. "That's Mr. Harris. That guy won't help anyone anymore. He's scared to death of catching COVID." Sure enough, the Humvee again seemed unwilling to stop. The old man behind the wheel was all masked up, too, with a clear face shield added for good measure. Yet there, from the mirror on his windshield, hung a tiny string of Christmas lights. Wasn't that a sign from Grandma? Maybe even from God? "He'll help us," Camilla yelled. "I know it. You have to stop him." Garrison didn't hesitate at her command. He jumped into the road, shining the flashlight into Mr. Harris's windshield and waving his arms like a madman.
Part 6 by Corinna Turner. The Humvee swerved around Garrison, accelerated, and was lost in the snow. Camilla stared after it, numb with disappointment. Not a sign from God, then. Just a hallucination from the shock. She glanced at Garrison, who was biting his lip. "I guess I'll have to take them back to the house one by one," he said. "But it's going to be difficult. Do you have any straps in the car?" Camilla frowned, trying to remember. It was a crazy plan. What if Mom or Dad fell off? But what else could they do? Maybe in the trunk. "I'll go look." Garrison moved toward the slope again. "Stay there in case another car comes." Relieved not to have to get in the snow again when her legs were already so cold, Camilla stayed put. Eventually Garrison's voice carried faintly over the howling wind, tinged with frustration and despair. "I can't find anything." "Oh no, how would they—" The hum of an engine suddenly penetrated the snowfall, headlights dazzling Camilla as a vehicle pulled to a halt. Green, and a Humvee. For real? Yes, there was the old man lowering the window. She rushed to the driver's door. Please help! Our car slid off the road, and my parents are unconscious, and my little brother's broken his ankle. Ah, heck. The old man's frail voice seemed strange coming from such a huge vehicle, and she had to strain to hear. I'm sorry I drove past, kiddo, but I'm immunocompromised. But I guess... He hesitated. Camilla waited, hardly daring to breathe. He'd come back specially, right? I guess there ain't nothing for it. Can you and that young man get them into the back? I can't do much these days. Of course, said Camilla quickly. We can manage, and we can put masks on. Just stay there, please. Relax, kiddo. I'm staying. The old man sounded resigned. God gave me a right talking to, well, metaphorically. Well, never mind now. Just get those injured folks in here. You bet. Camilla slid down the slope at top speed. Garrison, Mr. Harris came back. He what? But Garrison swung straight into action, wrapping Camilla's mom in blankets, before dragging her up the slope single-handed. He needed Camilla's help with her dad. Then the two of them were able to assist Max. Once they were finally inside, with the doors closed, Camilla flopped in the front seat and sighed in relief, not even caring if it dampened the mask she now wore. She'd never been so glad to be in a warm vehicle. Mr. Harris pulled away quickly. I'll take you straight to the emergency room. It's only 2 miles on from my place. As they rolled along, Garrison checking on her parents now and then, in a way that suggested he knew more about first aid than she did, Max's head soon drooped onto Garrison's shoulder. Camilla's eyelids grew heavy too, despite her worry for Mum and Dad. It was so lovely and warm. A screeching, smashing impact, and Camilla started awake as she was thrown sideways against her seatbelt. Mr. Harris was wrestling the careering car back into a straight line, gasping in shock and exertion. Dazed, Camilla stared at the hood, where one corner was scrunched up. What happened? Some idiot lost control and smacked right into us, wheezed the old man. Heck, that was close. Thank God they were all okay. But the Humvee was sputtering and shuddering, losing speed. As the vehicle inched along slower and slower, Mr. Harris whispered under his breath. Prayers or swears, Camilla couldn't tell. Finally, he swung off onto a driveway. We're not going to make it. This is my place. I don't have a landline, but, young man, you can harness up a team, right? If I tell you what to do. A team? Max half sobbed the question. What do you mean? Horses, said Garrison. Mr. Harris has some fine horses. That I do. Can't ride them any more, but the local girls take care of exercising them. But harness them to what? Camilla asked. Nothing will get through this. Sure it will, if it's made for it. I've got a good big sleigh. It's Santa's sleigh in the parade, most years. It'll get you and your folks there quick enough. A sleigh? Camilla's heart leapt. God really was looking after them. Very much in his own way.
Part 7 by A.J. Cattapan. Camilla didn't know how they did it. At every step, she nearly toppled over with exhaustion, but somehow she and Garrison managed to get everyone onto the sleigh and harness a team of horses under Mr. Harris's directions. The sleigh bumped over a mile of hilly countryside before entering a small town and pulling up to the local hospital. Mr. Harris turned to Garrison. "Young man, you help this kiddo get her family checked in. I'll wait out here and take you home once you're ready." The next few minutes were a flurry of activity as doctors and nurses rushed out to get Camilla's parents and brother off the sleigh and onto gurneys. Camilla turned to follow them when Garrison tugged on her coat sleeve. "Here." He shoved a small card into her gloved hand. "I don't know when the cell tower will be back up, but here's my number if you need anything." Camilla looked up at Garrison, his face etched in concern. "Thank you," she smiled faintly. She wanted to say more, but her family was being wheeled through the doors. She glanced at them before looking back at Garrison, but he was already climbing onto Mr. Harris's sleigh. She waved at them both before shoving Garrison's card into her front jean pocket without even looking at it. The snowfall was easing up, but she doubted that cell tower would be fixed anytime soon. Camilla rushed through the automatic doors of the hospital. She watched as her parents and brother were wheeled away to different rooms. After being examined briefly by another doctor to make sure she didn't have any injuries, Camilla found herself back in the waiting room. Half the seats had been roped off for social distancing, and the few remaining seats were already occupied. An elderly man slumped in a wheelchair and dozed while a woman beside him read a book. A mom held a crying baby. Camilla looked at the clock above the nurse's station. 7:30? They were supposed to have been at Grandpa's for dinner 2 hours ago. Camilla ran up to the nurse. "Please tell me you have a working landline. I have to get a hold of my grandpa." The nurse looked up from her computer. Her eyes twinkled over her mask. "You're the girl who came in on the sleigh, right?" Camilla nodded. The nurse picked up the phone. "Tell me your grandpa's number, and I'll try ringing his line." Camilla waited nervously as the nurse dialed the number. What must Grandpa be thinking? He must be worried sick about them. The nurse hung up the phone. "Sorry, sweetie, there's no answer. Why don't you take a seat and I'll try later." Where exactly should I sit?" Camilla indicated the lack of empty seats behind her. "I know the perfect place," said the nurse. She pointed to the wall on her right. "Follow the signs for the chapel. I'll send someone if there's any change with the family." "The chapel?" Camilla rolled her eyes. She didn't really want to, but there seemed no place left for her. After a few turns down some winding hallways, Camilla entered a simple chapel where a dozen seats faced a table covered with a white cloth in front of some stained glass windows. With a sigh, Camilla sat down on one of the wooden chairs with a padded seat. What now, God? How could he do this to her? This had truly been the worst year ever, and now she was going to spend Christmas Eve in a hospital chapel while her parents fought for their lives, and her grandpa was nowhere to be found. Tears rolled down her cheeks one after another until she slumped onto the floor, sobbing. She sat there, letting her heart pour out to God as the tears continued to flow. After what seemed like an eternity, Camilla picked herself up and sat back on the chair. She reached into her pocket to see if she had a tissue. Instead, she pulled out the card Garrison had given her. She hadn't even looked at it when she shoved it in her pocket, but now she realized he'd handed her a prayer card. On one side was a muscular-looking angel with a sword held high above his head. On the other was a prayer entitled, Prayer to St. Michael. Memories of a youth group session came back to her. Wasn't St. Michael the archangel who always came to fight battles? Did they have to be war-type battles, or could they be the fighting for your life type? Camilla figured it was worth a shot. What did she have to lose? She whispered the words to the prayer in the silence of the hospital chapel. Moments later, her phone buzzed. Startled, Camilla pulled it from her pocket and spotted a text message. "Camilla, it's Garrison. I have a Christmas surprise for you. Meet me at the entrance." Camilla blinked. How could this be? She still wasn't receiving any cell signal. Oh well, she might as well check the entrance. If nothing else, she could ask the nurse to try Grandpa's line again. There was no need to ask the nurse to call Grandpa, for when Camilla got to the entrance, Grandpa was walking through the door while Mr. Harris stood just outside. "Grandpa!" Camilla cried as she rushed to hug him. "Camilla, my dear." Grandpa enveloped her in his arms. He smelled of fresh firewood and coffee. "I'm so glad you're all right." Camilla sobbed again. St. Michael must have heard her prayer. Everything would be okay now. She knew that. If Grandpa could get to the hospital, then somehow God would fix everything else. After catching her breath, Camilla pulled away to look up at the gentle face of her grandfather. But how did you get here? This Mr. Harris found me as I was trying to clear the driveway. He told me I had to get in a sleigh, said he knew where you were, and I had to come with him. Camilla looked through the glass door at Mr. Harris standing in the cold in his mask and face shield. As if drawn by a magnet, Camilla left her grandfather's side and headed for the door. She thought maybe Garrison would be out there too, but he was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Harris, how did you know where my grandfather lived? Mr. Harris chuckled behind his mask. That friend of yours told me. Said I simply had to get your grandfather and bring him straight to the hospital. Said it wasn't right for a family that had been through so much to be separated at Christmas. But how did Garrison know where my grandpa lived? Mr. Harris tilted his head. Garrison? You mean that young man who was with you? Of course, who else would I be talking about? Mr. Harris reached up and scratched his head. I thought there was something a little odd about that boy when he disappeared off in the snow like that. Mr. Harris, what on earth are you talking about? Sorry, kiddo. I don't know what that young man told you, but when I asked him his name, he told me it was Michael.